Recently, I had a shoot where we needed to shoot some slow motion or high frame rate footage, and this was a lower budget production, so we didn't have the room to rent like a Phantom or even like a Red Epic or something else like that, something like one of the high-end Sony cameras that shoots the higher frame rates. So we had to go with something a little bit more budget conscious. Now, as you probably know from watching videos on my channel, or maybe you don't know this, but I usually shoot stuff with the GH4 when it's that lower budget, but we still need that high quality look. So I'll use the GH4. But the GH4 only does 60 frames a second at 1080, and it does have a 96 frames per second, but that mode is kind of broken. It doesn't look as good, and it's not quite as crisp and clear as 1080p should be. So it seemed like a good opportunity to rent NX1. So I did that. I rented a Samsung NX1, and this camera will actually do 120 frames per second at 1080. And from everything people said online was that it looked good. It was no quality issues like you have with the GH4 at 96 frames per second. So I thought this was a good opportunity to use the camera for the high frame rate option, for the slow motion option, but just to use the camera as well, because this camera does some other really cool stuff like 4K internally to SD cards, which I love. Sony just announced a few weeks ago the Sony A7R II, which will be doing 4K internally. That'll be one of the first Sony DSLR or mirrorless cameras that does 4K internally. The A7S, which I've done other videos on, does 4K but only over HDMI. And that, while it works and it works well, it's not always perfect in all situations. So you can go check out some of those videos if you're really curious to know more. But for the purposes of this, I wanted to talk about the NX1. And this isn't like a full review. It's just some of my thoughts, opinions, first impressions of the camera, because I really like the camera. That's the first thing I'll say. It feels good in the hand, unlike the A7S and the Sony stuff. I really wish Sony would change that form factor, but it feels good in the hand. Very similar to a GH4 or it's like a Canon DSLR, Nikon DSLR, like a smaller one where, it fits in your hand nice and you don't feel like you're going to drop it or like it's too small to hold. It feels good and it feels nice. So that was the first thing I noticed. The next thing I noticed was the unfortunate flip out screen. Samsung did the exact same thing that Sony does with their flip out screens, where it just tilts up and down and you don't actually it doesn't swing out like you get on the Lumix cameras from Panasonic, like the GH4. That's unfortunate because I really like that feature where you can swing it out, you can flip it up and down, and you can pivot and get that full, it's not like full 360 degree motion, but it's more flexible than just this. So that's the second thing I noticed, that I probably wouldn't be using the flip out screen all that much. But end of the day, it's about the image quality, and the handling and ergonomics of the camera are important, especially if it's a camera you're going to buy. But for this, where we were renting it just for a specific function, that's what I cared the most about. And I have to say, it works really, really well. I'm on some older firmware with this rental version, but Samsung has released a newer firmware that lets you select 120 frames per second, at least according to people online. That's what they say you can do. You can select 120 frames per second, but on the older firmware that I have, you have to go into the 1920 by 1080, 30 frames a second, and then go tell it to slow down by 0.25 x. So that's how you kind of, in a roundabout way, get to the 120 frames per second. But like I said, they've released newer firmware that kind of makes it a little bit easier to get to that function, but it did take me a little bit to kind of find where that was at. As far as the other image control flexibility things you have, it's full manual. There's no automatic, ISO or aperture or any limitations that they're putting on you. It's full manual, but compared to the GH4 and even the A7S in some regards, this feels a little bit more watered down. You have features where you can kind of pick your picture profile and you can set things and customize them the way you want, but it's not as full featured as the GH4. With the GH4, Panasonic really implemented a lot of more professional features where you have options in the camera that you wouldn't necessarily give to a normal average consumer. And this doesn't have some of those features, setting, for example, shutter angle instead of just shutter speed. I didn't find a way on the NX1 to do that. You're kind of stuck with the more traditional DSLR photography shutter speed instead of being able to pick my shutter angle, which as you might know, with your shooting higher frame rate stuff, your shutter speed has to adjust for that. So it's really convenient on other cameras where you can set a shutter angle, so it just does it automatically and the camera takes care of all the math for you. With the NX1, I had to kind of dial in my shutter speed based on the frame rate that I was shooting. So that was kind of an unfortunate workaround, but honestly, there's not a lot of cameras giving you shutter angle, especially in kind of this bracket where it's like a DSLR form factor. So I can't really fault them too much, but it is really nice when companies like Panasonic implement it on lower end consumer type cameras. But looking at the actual footage from this, it looks really nice. I did modify the picture profile. There's like it's funky. Because I've only had this for a few days because it is a rental. I haven't really gotten to play around like a lot with it, but there didn't seem to be a way to where I could put it into like video mode. It seems like you're always in like a photography mode and then you can shoot video as well. So one thing I noticed was I was controlling my picture profile and everything, and then I'd start recording video and everything would change. My contrast, my saturation, everything would change. And it's because I'm in manual mode. I'm not like, there's no, video mode to put it on the dial. And so I would go into video mode and everything would change. Like, right, my picture profile and everything would look different. And so I figured out that in the movie settings, there is a picture profile specifically for video recording, which is not displayed on the screen until you start recording. So I had to make my movie video picture profile match my photo picture profile so that my display was actually showing me what I'd end up being recording. And that was really weird to kind of wrap my mind around, because most other cameras, you have a dedicated movie mode and the settings and picture profiles you're picking there are represented in that mode. It's not like it's running two modes concurrently. So I thought that was kind of strange, but once I figured it out, again, not a huge problem. And it looks good. It's 1080, as close as you can get with like compressed internal H.265. I almost said H.264, but yes, this camera actually records H.265, which is, again, it's a good thing, but it's also a bad thing, because Premiere currently does not import H.265 or HEVC, high efficiency video codec or something like that. You can't import those files natively, so you have to convert to ProRes or something else. But again, it's like a workaround. That's what I'm finding with this camera. There's a lot of workarounds that you have to take into account. It's not just like pick it up, go, like I found with the GH4. And in some aspects, the A7S is like that. It's pretty straightforward. This one, it's a little bit trickier. There's a lot of things you have to, oh, okay, that's how it works. All right, well, then I have to do this to compensate. But once you take all that into account, it works really well, especially for the high frame rate and even the 4K stuff. Once I was able to dive into that picture profile and turn down the sharpness, turn down the contrast, because right out of the box, it was really contrasty, really sharp, and it just looked kind of like you wouldn't want it to. You know what I'm talking about? Like some people say it's like the video look. Well, it's just, all that's based on just different settings, right? And the settings were not to my liking. Maybe they're for, again, maybe a more consumer type person who wants it. I don't know, maybe they don't notice the aliasing and stuff, but like there are a lot of jaggies, really a lot of aliasing, because the sharpening was just turned way too high. So I turned all that down, turned saturation down so I didn't like clip any of my colors, turned contrast down. And once I did all that, and I used the gamma mode for dynamic range. There's 3 different gamma settings that you can pick from. So again, it's a little bit more limited in terms of picture profiles compared to something like, I know I keep bringing it up, but it's what I own, it's what I have, so I'm always going to kind of compare things to it, because right now it's my favorite camera. But like the GH4, where you have a lot of different picture profiles that you can choose from, and even like cameras, like Canon does a really good job with their picture profiles and giving you options and flexibility. The NX1, not quite as much, but what's there is nice. You can go in and adjust it. Now, this camera, like I said, does 4K, and I shot some stuff in 4K as well. Now, the max frame rate in 4K is 30 frames a second, which, that's pretty standard for most things. We'll see how that advances in the next few years. I'd imagine like the GH5 or potentially, I doubt Canon will do anything, but maybe Sony will do something where they're implementing higher frame rate 4K. But for now, 4K 30 is about the max frame rate on these kind of cameras. And that's okay because, a lot of times I will shoot, if it's like a B-roll element or something that doesn't need audio synced with it, I will shoot it at 30 just to get, and then slow it down to 24 in post-production just to get a little bit of a dreamier, creamier look without it looking like slow motion. If I need, something that is obviously slow, I'll shoot at 60, or in this case 120. And 120 is actually a sweet spot. I've talked about this in some blogs that I've written and other videos that I've produced, that 120 is a really nice sweet spot to be because it is strikingly slow motion. When you see it, you know that it's slow, that like it's got that dreamy, creamy feel to it, and that flows a little bit smoother and certainly slower, half as slow as 60 frames a second, where 60 is like, okay, you did your slow motion, but it's not really that slow. But 120 sits in that nice spot where you can do the slow motion stuff, but it's not, like 1,000 or 2,000 or 10,000 frames a second like you can do with some other cameras, more scientific type cameras or like the Phantoms, right? So if you need something that's like really, really, really slow, like bullet time slow, you'd obviously have to rent a camera for that. But if you just want to get something that's generically slow, 120 is really, really nice. And it's something that I really like. Red has, the Red cameras have offered 120 frames per second for quite a while now. And that was kind of when the Epic first came out, that was kind of, you could shoot 5K at 120, and that was kind of the highest resolution they offered and the most frames per second they offered in that resolution. And I really fell in love with that look. And it's nice that we're finally getting around to those features on cheaper cameras like this. Like the NX1 is really cheap. I think when it came out, it was like $1,300. Now you can find them as low as, I think they're down to like $1,000 on eBay. So if you're looking for a camera that does slow motion, I really recommend the NX1, especially if it's a camera you're going to buy. This is cheap enough to where you could buy it and have it be your primary camera. And like I said, it does 4K internally, which, as you know, I'm in love with that. I love the fact that I can do 4K right on the camera. I don't need any external recorders that I'm paying more for, or I'm eating up additional file size by recording at like 4K ProRes, especially if you don't need it. So being able to record 4K right to the SD card, well, in this case, you can't just pick up and play with it in Premiere because you have to convert it, but it's still a nice feature to have. And hopefully once the computing side ends up catching up and we can, edit H.265 in Premiere or in your editing program of choice, then it'll be really nice. Now, this camera I did notice some kind of odd compression artifacts every once in a while, especially at higher ISOs. That was unfortunate to see because it's not something I've seen on the GH4 as much. There is a little bit because it is a compressed codec. It's not RAW, it's not a high bitrate ProRes or something like that. But it was a little bit unfortunate to see. But again, it's one of those things, like I was shooting at high ISOs, probably not what you're going to be doing all the time. Like this is not a low light camera like the NX1. Like the A7S. This is the NX1. The A7S, that's the low light camera. So if you need low light, probably gonna have to go with the Sony for now. We'll see. Again, things can always change, but for right now, if you need low light, and like I've said in other videos, if you need low light, go with the A7S. If you need a good all-around camera, I'd say go with the GH4. But if you need something that does the higher frame rate, probably the NX1 is going to be a good bet for you. You just have to keep into account like all those little workarounds. So if you're okay with transcoding your files in post-production, this is a good camera for you. For me, that's kind of frustrating because I always save my raw data, right? So I'm going to save all the files that are on the SD card because you never want to delete your original source files. Never. I'd never recommend deleting that. So you have that, but then you can't edit those, so you've got to convert to ProRes. So you've essentially like doubled your file storage that you need to take into account because you can't edit the native files directly, right? So then you've got all these other files, and granted now they're ProRes, so they're like much larger in file size. So you not only doubled, maybe you've tripled or quadrupled your total storage, and you've got the original files you can't do anything with. You're just keeping them there as backup. So it can be a little problematic, especially for things where you're recording hours and hours and hours of footage, or you have multiple cameras all recording hours and hours and hours of footage. It's just one of those situations that you probably don't want to be in. So keep that in mind, at least for the time being. The computing power or the codecs or whatever, it's just not up to date. and so you can't edit the native files. The nice thing about the NX1 over the GH4 and some other cameras is the sensor size. So sensor in here is not full frame, but it's APS-C or Super 35 equivalent. So your crop factor, you're looking at 1.5 crop over a full frame. So not as shallow depth of field, not as wide a field of view as full frame, like on the 5D or the A7S, the A7 series from Sony. Those are all full frame. So you get that shallower depth of field, the wider field of view. But I really like Super 35. I think it's it's been the standard for how many years, how many movies have been shot Super 35. So it's a look that people are familiar with. You get the shallow depth of field, certainly. You probably want to, stop down. You don't want to shoot wide open at like a 1.4 or something, because your depth of field is it's next to nothing, right? Really hard to keep stuff in focus. But you can still do that, blurred background look and all that nice stuff, which is a little bit harder to do on some of the smaller sensor cameras like Micro Four Thirds, where you need to get like a speed booster or additional glass that you have to put in front of the camera to like simulate the wider field of view, shallower depth of field. So that's really nice. I really like that about the NX1, that you don't have to worry about getting a speed boost or anything like that. So another really nice feature of this camera. Other things, and just in terms of handling, it has I don't know if you can see it, but the record button is just like a tiny little dot, very similar to the A7 series from Sony. I hate that. I think it's really obnoxious that, especially because the record button is right next to this other button right here, and they feel almost identical. So when you're just trying to, in a pinch, you're like going to hit a button, you really, really, really have to make sure that you're hitting the record button and none of the other buttons up here. So really frustrating that you have to even worry about that. I much prefer Panasonic's method, where they have a record button on the back, but if you're in video mode, you can just pull the shutter button and that starts recording. And that's usually what I do, because it's firm, it's tactile. You know what you're doing, you know what you're getting, and there's no mysterious like mistakes that can be made where you're going to hit the wrong thing. The ISO white balance controls are all up here on the top left side of the camera, which I thought was kind of awkward placement. I got used to it because it's obvious, you know exactly where it's at, but I don't know how they expect you to kind of like hold the camera to control these things. I much prefer all my settings over here, and they could have put this little shutter dial right on the front, like you see with like Nikon cameras or something like that. Like, there's always ways to work around it, and I don't know why every camera company decides to do it different, because there certainly are objectively better ways to do it, and this just having these controls over here wasn't very good. I like how Canon designs their cameras, where everything is right on your right hand and you can get to any feature right here, and Panasonic does the same thing. Like the GH4 has everything right on the right hand, so you don't have to worry about using your left hand. Use your left hand to like stabilize your rig or do follow focus or whatever. You don't have to use it to interact with the camera. So another shortcoming of this camera. But when we're talking about handling, most people who are looking to be budget conscious they're gonna find a workaround, and it'll work for them, especially because the features you get with this camera are really valuable, like the slow motion and the 4K internal. Another cool thing about this camera that I thought was neat and worth mentioning, it runs on normal batteries or whatever. It's got Samsung's probably proprietary battery or whatever, but the charger, rather than having some kind of like plug it into the wall, it actually has a USB right there. So it comes with a cord, that plugs into the wall, but it attaches to the charger USB. So in theory, you could, as long as you have a USB cable, which most of us do, and this is a micro connection, micro USB, you can charge a battery, which I thought was really, really handy, considering I was just in Europe a little bit ago, and you've got the different wall outlets, and so you need to have an adapter for that, and that's not always available. So having a USB charger, I thought was pretty smart, pretty clever, and didn't sacrifice anything, because it's just the connection here. The cord on the other end, it's not like you have to use USB. This is a standard, wall outlet type connector. So it's just like an extra feature, and I thought that was kind of nice. Another cool thing about this camera, and you probably already know this, but most cameras that I'm shooting with now are mirrorless, so I'm not really doing anything on Canon or Nikon, their DSLRs, because the video quality is not that good. But Samsung was smart, and this is a mirrorless mount. So the NX mount that Samsung has is mirrorless. So that means that you can adapt pretty much any lens you want to it. Now, The Samsung mount isn't that popular, so the adapters are a little bit harder to find compared to Micro Four Thirds and the Sony E mount or FE mount, whatever you want. The Sony E mount. Those adapters are a little bit more popular and a little bit more common, so they're easier to find. But I was able to find a Nikon to a Samsung adapter, and it's just a piece of metal. It works like most adapters that you've ever seen. There's no aperture control or anything like that for G lenses on here, so you would have to keep that in mind. I didn't even see an adapter that would let you control Nikon G lenses, but most of my Nikon lenses are a little bit older, so they have the manual aperture ring. So again, not an issue for me, but that might be an issue for you. I believe they have Canon adapters, but again, they're not electronic, so the aperture is going to be locked, or you have to do some kind of workaround. Again, another workaround for the camera. But of course, you can always buy or rent a native Samsung lens, but I don't know that I'd recommend that, because like I've said in other videos and other blog posts that I've done, is anytime you're buying into a lens system, keep in mind that those lenses, you'll ideally, if you're going to spend $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 in some cases, if you're really spending a lot of money on a lens, you want that lens to last longer. You don't want to have to buy it for a year and then sell it when you switch cameras or whatever. So you're investing in a system, in a platform, if you will, of lenses, and you want it to last. So buying, let's say, a Samsung lens, oh yeah, it works, autofocus, you get all those great features, but then let's say in a year or two you switch to Canon, or you switch to Fuji, or you switch to Sony. Those lenses probably aren't going to work, or you're going to have to do some kind of workaround to get them to work. So that's why I really recommend, especially for video, because for video, you're probably not doing autofocus. You don't need kind of any like automatic features or anything like that. Getting some older like Nikon lenses, because Nikon lenses can adapt to pretty much anything, where like even Canon lenses, you can't, like old Canon FD lenses, you can't use on Nikon, you can't use on certain cameras. So getting the Nikon glass, the older Nikon glass with the aperture ring, or having an adapter that has the control for the G lenses is my recommended way to go. I know it's not for everybody, because you lose things like stabilization if there's no in-body camera stabilization, which the NX1 doesn't have, unfortunately. But again, not a huge deal breaker, especially considering the price point. But it is something to keep in mind, that if you're going to buy this camera or rent it or use it, make sure that you have lenses that will work with it. So you can use all the adapters you want. There's tons of them out there. You can find different stuff, but the lenses have to kind of work with that format. And if you're going to buy lenses for this camera, really, really make sure that's what you want to do, because the photos from this look really nice, and so having this as a photography camera as well would be really good. But then you have to get the Samsung lenses for autofocus and whatnot, which, let's face it, they're not the most popular lenses or cameras. So you lose a lot of the flexibility that you would get, like, let's say, with Canon lenses, which people love to adapt to different formats. Now there's adapters for Micro Four Thirds and for Sony E mount, all these different mounts that adapt the Canon lenses. So just really keep that in mind. I can't stress it enough that when you're buying lenses, make sure you're thinking long term and not just, oh yeah, I got a camera, so I'm gonna get lenses for it, because that can end up biting you if you're not careful. One final thing I'll say about the NX1 is that the screen, even though despite it has the kind of crappy flip functionality, it's a really, really nice screen. I don't think I've seen a screen that worked as well outdoors as this one. So this is an AMOLED screen, and maybe you say AMOLED. I don't know. You read these things online and then it's like, oh, that's not how you say it. You say it this way. But AMOLED, it's really bright. You can see it clear as day in daylight, which we were shooting outside. So I had no problems with like glare or anything. The only thing that was an issue is I had to shade my eyes a little bit, but you have to do that anyway. But seeing the screen, I was really, really surprised at how clear and bright the screen was. Much better than other cameras I've used with their traditional LCD or OLED screens. So another really good feature to have on the Samsung, because oftentimes you will be shooting outside and you want to see what you're looking at. So Good thing. And finally, battery life is good, much better than the A7S. I don't know why Sony is obsessed with making like the smallest camera possible, and I get it for like drones, but the batteries on that thing are so small. The NX1 has decent sized batteries. Battery life was good. It's held up all day. We weren't shooting all day, but it was good. No issues or problems there. It operated like I expected it to. So another good thing about the NX1. But overall, I don't know if I could recommend like saying that you need to buy this camera. It's definitely good to rent because it's super cheap to rent. But even if you wanted to buy it, it's really cheap. However, there are a lot of workarounds. So that's why I wouldn't say it's like definitely recommend it. You really have to know if you're going to be okay with all the setbacks and drawbacks in order to get those additional features, because the slow motion, it's twice as slow as what you can do with the GH4, because let's face it, on the GH4 you're not going to shoot 96 frames per second because it just doesn't look good. It might be slower, but man, it really takes a resolution hit. Not so with the NX1. But like I said, if you want those additional features, you got to be willing to work with some of the setbacks and drawbacks. And for some people, myself included, I don't want to have to deal with all those. It works really well if you need it for a particular project, but as like your go-to camera, the one you're going to have every day, all the time, I think after a while you'd end up getting frustrated. So let's hope that Samsung, with the NX2 or whatever they end up going with, maybe it's like NX1 Mark II, I don't know, they'll fix some of those things, change a little bit about the form factor, give you a few more options in the menu, like, setting your shutter angle or giving you a few more picture profile options, giving us those features, and then probably changing, kind of the layout, the ergonomics of the camera a little bit, just kind of how the buttons are positioned. And it will be awesome. Especially too, if Adobe ends up updating Premiere. So even in Premiere, the 2015 version that they just released, there's still no support for H.265 or HEVC, whatever these stupid codecs are called. I'll keep calling it H.265 because that's pretty easy. But yeah, unfortunate that there's no support for that yet. I imagine it'll come maybe later this year or further down the road, but for the time being, it is slightly a problem that you have to convert everything. So just keep that all in mind. But at the end of the day, in terms of image quality, this camera performs remarkably well. Looks really, really nice. Certainly one of the top three in my mind right now. It's the GH4, A7S, and the NX1. It's just a matter of kind of pick your poison. What do you want to deal with? The GH4, it's the smaller sensor size. The A7S, it's certainly the handling, the ergonomics, and the low battery life is the most frustrating on that camera. And with this one, it's kind of a combination of the two. It's interesting. They're all kind of have their own little quirks, but I'm sure if you're doing your research and you're looking all this stuff up and you're figuring out what's going to work best for the kind of projects you shoot, the stuff that you work on, you'll be able to pick what makes the most sense for you, at least right now. Who knows? In a year, it'll probably be something else. And 2 years, it most certainly will be.